Hello and welcome everyone to the meetup on WordPress with Docker. This meetup is going to be for both beginners and advanced. And me and Devarshi both are WordPress engineers at Articam, and we are going to cover the basics of Docker. If you haven't heard about Docker, don't worry about it. We are going to cover everything right from scratch, the basic, what is Docker, what are the different features it offers, how to install it, how to set it up, how to set up WordPress with Docker. So all of the information will be covered in this session. Okay, so let's begin. So the first question comes to your mind that what do I need to know to learn Docker? I mean, for some of us, including me, at some point Docker had been really complex stuff, and I really didn't think that I would be able to learn this, and I always found Docker to be really complex unless I actually digged into it and took it in a simpler fashion. So to learn Docker, all you need to know is just the command line usage and tools. That's all you need, and I'm sure most of you are programmers and you have used you use command line tools on a day-to-day basis. So what is Docker actually? So Docker is an open source software platform for building container-based application. It was started as an open source project in 2013, and it then picked up. What it does is it carves up a computer into sealed containers that run your code. What are containers? We will come to that. So containers are small and lightweight execution environment that make shared use of operating system kernel but otherwise run in isolation from another. Okay, so containers are nothing but they are execution environment, and they are sealed and self-contained units, so they can run different operations in an isolation. So let's take a look at Docker in a nutshell. If you want to run it on Windows or Mac, then Docker needs a Linux server to manage, so we can run Linux server in a virtual machine. So let's see how that goes. So let's say this is your computer where you write stuff, and inside of this you have your terminal. And on the right hand side you see that you have server program called Docker host. So on the left hand side you have the Docker client, and on the right hand side you have the Docker host. So when you run commands like docker build, docker pull, then you actually interact with the client program named docker CLI, and then it in turns interact with the server program named docker host. Inside of docker host you have Linux virtual machine, and inside of this Linux virtual machine you have the Docker desktop. Now if you're on Mac, then you can have the Docker desktop for Mac, and if you're on Windows, then you will have Docker desktop for Windows. So it could be either of these. And Docker host is the one which actually controls the Linux virtual machine. So let's talk a little bit more about Docker based on the understanding that we had. So Docker, as you can see, is a client-side program that you run from the terminal, but also you can run it from the server as well. So Docker is also a server program that manages the Linux system. It is a program that takes your code, bundles it up, and seals it into a container. So you can actually spin up your containers using Docker. Docker is also a service that distributes containers so people can share their work. Now another question would come to your mind that why even use Docker? Could I not just use my basic setup, maybe MAMP or XAMPP or whatever I'm comfortable with? Why do I even need to learn Docker? What's the advantage? So you would agree to me that developing apps today can require multiple languages, frameworks, and architecture. Now Docker simplifies and accelerates your workflow. It gives developers the freedom they need to innovate their choices of tools, applications, stacks, deployment environments for each project. And it kind of wraps everything into their self-contained, isolated environment, so it doesn't disturb the other one. So the first thing is its simplicity. Docker's friendly CLI-based workflow makes building, sharing, and running containerized applications accessible to developers of all skill level, which means you really don't need to be highly skilled developer to use Docker. All you need to know is just basic terminal commands and you're happy to use. It's only when you are writing the Docker files probably you may need some skills, but when you just want to use it for your, let's say for your WordPress project, then all you need to know is just basic command and that's it. In fact, when I started using Docker myself, I was so happy with it that from that time I haven't really switched to anything else beside Docker. And even if somebody wants to go to something else, I always recommend them to use Docker because of its simplicity, and absolutely love it. It's also agile, which means install from a single package to get up and running in minutes. So you have all of the dependencies, everything self-contained, and the code and test locally while ensuring consistency between development and production. So this is one of the best features about Docker that I like, that you can have the same environment for local as well as you can have the same one in production as well. So you won't have this issue of your code doesn't work for me. It's a common problem for most developers that you say, oh, this works for you but doesn't work for me. So that problem won't be there, because if you're using the same Docker file, then all of the developers will have the same environment and you don't really have to worry about these basic stuff and you can really focus on development. Okay, you can collaborate easily. So you can use certified community provided images in your project and push to the cloud-based application registry and collaborate with team members. So even for WordPress, you have the Docker image available, which is community provided images. It's trustworthy, you can use it, and the community maintains it as well. You can write your own Docker file as well and share it with the community. Alright, so what's the status of Docker today? Well, Docker containers are everywhere. It's there on Linux, Windows, data center, cloud, and even serverless, etc. Okay, so now the question comes to your mind that why not use virtual machine? Why Docker? What's the difference between the two? So I would like Devarshi to explain this part. Devarshi, would you like to tell us more about this?
Hi everyone. So VM runs their own operating system whilst a container shares the kernel of the host operating system. As a VM is running a full operating system, it will be more resource hungry in terms of hardware, and the boot time will be higher than a Docker container. As you can see in the image, the Docker is running directly on the host system, but in the case of a virtual machine, there is a full operating system running on top of a hypervisor. And as I mentioned before, an operating system is more resource hungry than a Docker container. Now, talking about the process isolation, a virtual machine is hardware level process isolation, whilst Docker container is operating system level operating system level process isolation. So, as you might have figured out, the Docker container is more lightweight, it will take less boot time, and it is, pretty famous now these days. So you might be able to find the pre-built image for your application, which is possibly smaller tweaks will be there. But in terms of virtual machine, it is really tough to find the perfect image for your use case, which you can tweak very easily.
Absolutely. I totally agree, and I remember that when I was learning to use virtual machine, I didn't quite enjoy that, and those were the time when I actually had the 8 GB RAM MacBook Air, and it would just die on me because it's going to use so much of RAM. So yeah, I agree to you, Devarshi, that I didn't quite like virtual machine for that reason. Docker is definitely better in that regards. Okay. So let's take a look at the flow of the Docker, how things work under the hood. So in Docker, you have something called an image. So what is this image? Well, image is nothing but just a file that makes up just enough operating system that you need to run your service. That's all image is, just a file which contains a bunch of configurations. So what happens? How do we build containers then? Well, what Docker does is when you run a command called docker run, it's going to spin up a container for you. And what is actually a container then? Well, a container is nothing but it's an image which has processes running inside of it. So if you run the docker run command, you will have a running container. And if you want to stop it, you can run a command in Docker from your terminal called docker kill. If you do that, the container is going to get stopped. When the container gets stopped, it doesn't mean it gets deleted. It's just that it shows a message that it's exited. So Devarshu is going to show you in sometimes when he gives you the live demo of running up different containers. You will see that happening. All right. So a stop container is basically the one which does not have the process running in it. Now there could be sometimes you may want to build a new image out of it. Maybe you have installed something on that and you want to build a new image for that. Well, you could do that by running a command called docker commit. So what docker commit will do is that it's going to create a new image from the exited container. Alright, so a little bit more about what Docker containers are. So as you already know, this is nothing but an image where you have the processes running inside of it, and it's a self-contained sealed unit of software. It contains everything that you need to run the service. So it bundles together all the code, config, processes, networking, dependencies, and just enough operating system to run your code. Okay, so with this, now we're going to learn how to install Docker. So I'm going to ask Devashi to show us how do we install Docker.
Docker installation. Docker installation is pretty straightforward. The installation steps required for Mac OS, Windows, and Linux is different, and it is already shared in the slides. The slides will be shared right after the session ends. The next step is creating a container. Creating a container will require a Docker image. Docker automatically pulls the Docker image if it is not already on your local system. However, if you just want to pull a Docker image, you can run docker pull command. I'll be giving an example that how you can run a Docker container out of the Ubuntu image. For now, as you can see in my screen, I'll be running this command -it docker run -it ubuntu bash. Awesome. As I already had the Ubuntu image on my system, it did not pull and it created a container out of that image directly. As you can see, I have passed an -it flag, which is there to give me an interactive access to the Docker container shell, which is -i is for providing a sudo providing a standard input, and T is for provide a sudo tty. Awesome. In the next terminal screen, what I'll do is run docker container ls, and as you can see, my Docker container is already there. It is status is up and created before 40 seconds. The name is there because we have not passed any name flags, but it is there because of the Docker already allocated a random name to it. If I run the ls command inside the Docker container, you can see that all the files required for a Ubuntu operating system is already there. I can run anything here, and for now I'll just exit in. We are out of the Docker container, and go to the next terminal session and run docker container ls-a. Now as you can see, with -a parameter, I can see all the stopped containers. As you can see that our container is still here, recursing her shell, and the status is exited before 10 seconds ago. Awesome. What is Docker Compose? Compose is a tool for defining and running multi-container Docker applications. Let's say if you have 5 Docker images in your application, 5 Docker containers, port related parameters, few other stuff related to networking, and some commands as well. Now, running that in as a bash command would be super long, and no one likes to see that, and it won't be giving you a very nice experience. So for that, as you can see in my screen, this is how an example MySQL would look like if I try to run on a bash with a bash command. It's not so good. So Docker compose file provides you a YAML file to configure your Docker environment. This is pretty nice and pretty straightforward, and we'll be seeing the example in next part. Setting up WordPress with Docker. Now I have divided the Docker compose file for our WordPress environment in few parts to make it simple to understand. A Docker compose file starts with a version of compose file format. In our example, it is version 3.3. The next thing we define is services. You can see that there is a service called Composer. The name of the service will be Composer. It will be using Composer image. The command which we want to run after the container starts is update, and one thing is volumes. Now what volumes is, we are mounting the local directory WordPress to the container as /app path in /app path. So what we'll do is, our WordPress directory in here, it will mount this WordPress directory inside the Docker container at /add path, and then run this command. Next thing is MySQL container. The image in this part is MySQL. Restart always is a new flag that we are seeing here with environment. So restart always is for always restarting a container. When you specify always, the Docker daemon will restart container indefinitely, which means that in case the application fails, for example, due to some error or something, and Docker containers goes into stop status, it will automatically restart the container once again. So your application will be back up and running within a few seconds. And environment is for environmental variables that you want to pass inside the Docker container. Volumes, as we discussed before, the /mysql to varlib mysql. If the /mysql doesn't exist, it will automatically create a MySQL directory for us. The next part is phpmyadmin. For that, we'll be using phpmyadmin image. It depends on MySQL. So the depends on is also a new thing, which means that the phpmyadmin Docker container will not start running until the MySQL isn't started, which is super simple and super awesome. The next thing is environmental variables, restart always, and ports. Let's say our internal service is running inside the container on port 80, but you want to access that service on different port in your system, then you can use this parameter. It is not limited that there. If you want to use a specific service on the same port, you can do that as well. In our Docker stack, phpmyadmin will be running on port 80 inside the Docker container, but it will be accessible on your system on port 8183. Next part is our WordPress Docker image. As you can see, it is pretty simple and straightforward. As we have discussed ago, it has depends on MySQL and Composer. Image is WordPress latest, ports is 8020 to 80. So in this example, the WordPress is running inside the container on port 80, but we can access that on port 8020. Restart always, and some environment variables for WordPress host, user, and password. Database host, I meant. Now let's see a demo that how it looks like within the terminal. So I will run for that. As you can see that I have Docker compose file already with me here, and it is the same one, and I'll run docker compose up. So you can see that it is creating MySQL 1, Composer, phpmyadmin, and WordPress. So you can see few logs on my screen as well. They are because the containers are starting and WordPress is already running, but MySQL isn't running. So let's give it a five minutes or so to complete the process. Meanwhile, if we go here and run docker container ls, we can see that all of our 4 images are running right now. Now, as you can see, it seems like everything is fine. What I'll do is I'll create a new incognito window, hit my IP address on port 8020 and hit enter. As you can see, the WordPress installation is ready. Now I hit continue. Site title docker wp example. Username will be admin. I don't want a complex password, so I'll hit admin as well for the password. Confirm use of weak password. Email would be admin@local.test and install WordPress. Awesome. We now have our WordPress installation ready, and if I hit login, the username would be admin, password is admin. Login. Awesome. We are inside WP admin. Now if I go here and see plugins, the plugins are here already, which I have provided in the composer.json inside the WordPress directory. So at this point we have our WordPress setup ready with the Docker. Now let's see how our phpmyadmin looks like. So if I go here, copy and paste the same port, same IP address, and hit port 8183 for phpmyadmin. Awesome. Our server name is mysql, and if I go here and cat and you can see my MySQL password as root password is root. So I'll quickly, username will be root and the password is root. You can alternatively use WordPress database user and password as well, but for this example I'll be using root and root, and you can see the WordPress database over here. Awesome. Now go to the slide, and yes, so we have our deployment ready on local for WordPress. We have seen an example of accessing Docker on port 8020 and phpmyadmin on port 8183. Hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed the session, and if you want to learn more about it, these are the links that are available. You can go to techio.dev docker, techio.dev/docker for kits HTML, and all of these links I mentioned over here will give you more information about the Docker. Okay, and if you are a beginner and if you want to learn about coding, you can go to codeytek.com/courses, and you can learn about Babel, Gatsby, Git, JavaScript, progressive web apps, WordPress, WEBPACK, REDUX, and all sort of things. And you can follow us on Twitter and GitHub. My Twitter handle is imranhsayed, and same goes for the GitHub. And for Devarshi, it's dhsatya, and the Twitter and the GitHub handle is dhsatya as well. All right. Okay. Thank you very much.